Welcome into another Musketeer Report podcast. Today is March 6, 2025. Xavier is coming off an 83-61 win over Creighton and a 91-78 win at Butler. The Musketeers are now 20-10 overall, 12-7 in Big East play, with one game left at home against Providence. That'll be Senior Day at the Cintas Center on Saturday. They're ranked 42nd overall on KenPom and 47th in the net. They are currently sitting as the second team out on Bracket Matrix, appearing on 28 of 118 reporting brackets. And that's where we'll start today's show with Paul Fritschner, who is back joining me. Paul, it's been a fun stretch for Xavier fans. I know you were in Indianapolis at Hinkle Fieldhouse taking in the events of Wednesday night's win over the Bulldogs. Always good for Xavier fans to go up to Hinkle and get a win. It sounded like there were a lot of Xavier fans there. You could hear it coming through the TV.
Yeah, there were. It's Hinkle Fieldhouse. I was just talking to Adam at practice a few minutes ago about how it's amazing to me that when Xavier goes to Hinkle, it feels like there's a huge Xavier contingent. A lot of fans make the trip. It never feels reciprocated. I never feel like when Butler plays at Cintas, there's a big group of Butler fans there. And even going back to some of the days, I know Butler's been down recently, but even going back to the days of Kamar Baldwin or some of the earlier days, the Chris Holtman teams, I don't even remember those Butler fans taking over Cintas the way that Xavier fans took over Hinkle last night. And really not even just last night, consistently over the last few years.
No, that's a really good point. I don't think that's happened at the Cintas Center ever that I can recall in the, this 15 years now of covering the team. I don't remember that happening.
I can't think of any game ever. The one game I can think of that stands out to me as having a lot of opposing fans was the Indiana game and the Gavitt games a few years ago. There was a lot of red in that building,
especially in the lower bowl.
Yeah. That game to me always sticks out as a game that had a ton of opposing fans. Even the shootouts, and maybe that's just because Xavier is pretty. I want to say they've had a lot of success in the shootout over the last 20 years in that building. So maybe there have been a lot of Cincinnati fans. They just haven't had a lot of reason to cheer. I don't know.
True.
But just thinking about how the games go back to the Butler point, it was a lot of fun last night at Hinkle for a ton of Xavier fans that were in attendance.
All right. I mentioned at the top of the show, Xavier's coming off those two big wins. And obviously they've been on a nice run here, winning 6 in a row. But those were the two biggest in this stretch to pull off. The home game against Creighton and the Senior Day win at Hinkle Fieldhouse against Butler. Were you more impressed by the win over Creighton or the win at Butler?
I could give you the political answer here and say my reasoning for both, but I'll give you my straight answer. And I will say the Creighton game, just because it felt like there was so much building up to that game. There was so much anticipation. Creighton's a good team with one of the best, if not the best players in the conference. They make a ton of threes. It just felt like a game that if Xavier didn't come out of the gates hot and didn't assert themselves, it just felt like a game that things might have been able to go sideways in, and they never let that happen. Sometimes when there's all this anticipation as a college athlete, maybe you get caught up in it. To these guys' credit, to the coaching staff's credit, to everybody around the program, that they didn't let that happen. Now, the political answer in me would kind of go back to that Butler game last night and say they could have gotten caught up in what happened on Saturday and had a letdown performance on the road on senior night. That didn't happen last night either. But I'd still say the Creighton game to me was more impressive than what they did last night against a Butler team that they matched up pretty well with.
Yeah, that's my answer too. And that last point you made is really the big one for me. It's just like Creighton is a much better team than Butler, and especially for Xavier, it's a much more difficult matchup. So winning that game over Creighton at home, after they won that one, I kind of felt like unless, you just really get a blazing hot shooting performance by Butler from 3-point range. And it felt like at one point in the first half, we might get that as they stormed back and made it close there before halftime. But I other than that, outside of something like that, and again, them using the junk defenses, which they did try to do with mixing between the zone and the man-to-man, it just, they don't match up well with Xavier at all. The way they play, their style, their personnel, everything about them makes them one of the better matchups for Xavier that we've seen all year, if not the very best. And I wrote last night, I think if Xavier played Butler 10 times this year, they'd win 9 out of 10 games. And the 10th would just be the fluky performance where Butler shoots the lights out and there's nothing you can do about it.
But even think about last night, Rick. Butler made 8 threes in the first half and Xavier was still up 4 at halftime.
Right. I mean, that's my point, right? I mean, it's college basketball. So at some point, you're going to lose 1 out of 10 to a legit high major team almost regardless. I mean, even maybe DePaul and Seton Hall this year, you might lose to one of them. But like this Butler team for Xavier is just a fantastic matchup. So yeah, I thought the Creighton win was more impressive for that reason, especially. I thought maybe as we sort of go back through these games and talk about them, one way to do it would be looking at what the coaches said, the opposing coaches in each game, because I thought both opposing coaches had some interesting comments about the Musketeers. Starting with Greg McDermott's, he kind of made the comments about nobody's really done that to our defense all year, and we haven't been beaten like this in a long time. And I think that resonated with Xavier fans because it was like, I mean, it felt like you did just throttle a pretty good Creighton team. And Xavier had the scouting report locked in. They had their game plan ready to go. They executed from start to finish. And it wasn't that Creighton played terribly. It was just that they ran into a buzzsaw that was not only Xavier ready to go, but also the Cintas Center was absolutely rocking.
Yeah, and to Xavier's credit, that looked like a team that had taken a week off and utilized their time off well. Not taken a week off in terms of not practicing. I just mean had to buy a week there leading into that Creighton game. They did take 2 days off in the week, not consecutive, but just to allow themselves to rest, allow them to recharge heading into the Big East tournament, heading into this stretch run of March. To have that entire week to practice, to scout, to go over film, to go over what you need to do on the court to be able to beat Creighton. While Creighton only had a couple of days turnaround, they go on the road. They have to come to Cintas for a crazy environment. All of those mitigating factors. Greg McDermott talked about that after the game. He mentioned this looked like a team that had a week to prepare for us, and there was no stone left unturned. There was no hole uncovered that this Xavier team was not prepared for in that Creighton game. And you talked about this yesterday on the radio, Rick. We were sitting in the car listening to your segment with Mo on the way up to Indianapolis, and I thought you made a great point, and I just totally lost what I was going to say, Rick. I don't know
Was
what I don't know what your great point was
was it
that I was.
about Ryan Kalkbrenner
It was
and
about
Sean
Ryan
Miller's?
Kalkbrenner and you
Yeah,
and Mo were going back and forth. Thank you very much. It was about you, Ryan Kalkbrenner, and the fact that he scored 23 points in that game, but it never felt like he took over. Right? They were he McDermott said afterwards that they were able to establish Kalkbrenner in the second half somewhat better than they did in the first half, but they never got to a point like in the first game where he only scored 6 less points at Cintas, but in that first game, Rick, they could go to the lob, they could
no.
feed it inside, they could do whatever they wanted through Kalkbrenner, and Xavier had no ability to stop him. That was not the case at all, and I never felt like Kalkbrenner was giving them the kind of trouble that he's given a lot of teams this year.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right, Paul. I felt like in the first game, he was absolutely dominant. And it was really just he went wherever he wanted. When they got in trouble or when Xavier felt like they were starting to gain some momentum, it was just like Kalkbrenner go down low, lob the ball right up to him. He doesn't even really have to post up. It was just like, we'll throw it to him. Zach can't go get it. He'll score right over top of Zach, and it's easy. It's total domination. There's nothing you can do about it.
And
And then
how about John Hughley too?
yeah, and then in this matchup, it's like one, they weren't able to do that. They had a double team ready. Zach was better, I think, about not letting him catch wherever he wanted. And when you looked at the box score, it's like, yeah, the numbers actually didn't look all that different for Kalkbrenner because he did end up getting to 23 points. He had that one stretch in the second half where they made a little bit of a run to get back into the game initially. And he had like maybe 6 points in a row there or something, like 6 of 8 points, something like that. And he was kind of dominant for a short little stretch, but that was it. Xavier shut it off. They had an answer. And to your point, one of the answers was John Hughley coming off the bench, being able to guard one-on-one. And part of that being so big is when you can do that occasionally, it means you don't have to double down as much. And it means you don't have to leave their shooters on the perimeter as much. And Sean Miller talked about the fact that their game plan really wasn't to worry about the 3-point shooters of Creighton. It was to try to take Kalkbrenner away. And, maybe they did a slightly better job. He didn't think they did a great job of taking him away in that second matchup, even though that was their main focus. But I think some of what you saw, them making him catch it farther away from the basket, meant they didn't have to double as hard. Hughley coming in and holding his own when he was in there guarding him meant the same thing. And so that helped against the shooters to some extent. And then the other thing is, I looked this up on Bart Torvik, Creighton has one of the biggest drops from their home and road splits when it comes to shooting. They are a much better shooting team at home than they are on the road. So I think Xavier benefited from that somewhat too, just that Creighton isn't going to knock down as many threes when they're playing in your building as opposed to theirs.
Yeah, exactly. And so for all of that, I would say that Xavier played so exceptionally well on Saturday that obviously you could tell the sentiment from the fan base was, okay, you check that box, but let's not have a letdown game on the road in an important one at Hinkle Fieldhouse on Wednesday, and that didn't happen either.
No, let me ask you one more thing about Greg McDermott's comments
Yeah.
after the game. He said they're one of the more difficult teams to come up with a scheme to stop them. And then he also made the comment about when Dante Maddox plays like that, it's hard to cover both him and Conwell. I thought that was interesting because, the narrative as we got into January and Xavier was struggling, and it's like, hey, it's looking like they're going to miss the tournament again this year. We started talking about the lack of talent on this team and the significant upgrade that needed to be made in the transfer portal. And not to say that isn't still true. Like, I do think this team lacks athleticism in certain spots. And obviously, they're going to have to make an upgrade in the transfer portal because a lot of the roster is going to turn over after this season. So I guess where I'm going with this is that we talked before the season about the firepower they would have on offense and their ability to score and how it would be difficult to match up with. And it does feel like that has finally come to fruition. And you're even hearing other coaches talk about it as like, yeah, they're difficult to game plan for. Watching them on tape, it's like, okay, you take this guy away, but then you're leaving yourself exposed to this guy potentially. And I think Dante Maddox has had a lot to do with that, getting him going to where he doesn't have to score big every night, but he's a threat that you're worried about. And you're like, well, if we let him run off screens freely over on the other side of the floor, he's going to bury us and get hot. You have to be cognizant of that. And then Dalen Swain also attacking downhill and being a threat to beat you off the bounce and get to the rim. All of that has made this offense a lot more dynamic.
Rick, we took a lot of heat in December and January for what we had said about this team in the preseason versus what they looked like on the court. Over the last month and change, this team is what we watched for 5 months in the preseason. It's just taken them a while to get to this point. But this offensive production that we've seen, I mean, in this 6-game winning streak, they haven't scored less than 73 points over the course of these 6 games. They've scored 91, they've scored 85, they've scored 83, they've scored 91 again. They are mixing in a ton of really talented shooting performances. They're the 10th best three-point shooting team in the entire country. They're on track to be the best free throw shooting team in program history. They aren't scoring around the rim as much as some other teams are, but I just think that what's happening right now with the mix of being able to rely on guys off the bench, even Jerome Hunter having 9 points against Butler the other night. You have Dante Maddox having 16 against Creighton. Different guys are starting to step up, that they're not relying so much on their starting group, that now you're seeing almost this weight be lifted off of the shoulders of some of the guys in the starting lineup that felt like maybe they had to do too much. Now they know they can rely on everybody on this team to contribute. And yeah, there might be an off night. Dante Maddox would be the first to tell you he didn't have a great night against Butler, but that's all right. John Hughley hit a 3. Jerome Hunter had 9 points, and it all worked out.
Yeah, and I mean that was another thing that Matta said was, that's like Xavier's a really good team. I haven't seen anybody in the country playing better than them right now. And when their bench comes in, they don't skip a beat. And I guess we kind of knew that with the way they've been playing recently. But to hear an opposing coach say that in a press conference of like Xavier's bench is now a strength for this team, and Paul, it felt like it was not that long ago we were like, this team is getting absolutely nothing from its bench. I mean, they sub at all, and it's an instant run for the other team. You feel like you can't give your starters a break, and now you really do. You feel like you're getting a nice boost almost regardless of which 3 guys are checking in there. Jerome Hunter's been making plays, knocking down some open shots, having some good defensive moments. John Hughley isn't, he's getting the threes occasionally, which is fun and fires everybody up, but like more so than scoring, it's been the checking in and playing solid defense and just being a physical presence for a few minutes without falling down and stumbling all around and not knowing where he's going and screwing up ball screen coverages or whatever. Like when he's just been solid in there and been a physical presence, that's all they really need out of him in that role. And then, like I talked about with Jerome, he's been much better too recently.
And if you look at what John Hughley did last night against Butler, Sean talked about it after the game that John had a fantastic night, they just couldn't keep him on the court because Zach was having an even better night.
He was too good.
Sean said, we loved how John played tonight, right? Like, he was having a fantastic game, but
He earned more minutes.
he had earned more minutes,
Yeah.
but it was hard to put John out there when Zach was having the kind of night that he was having. And I think that's the thing that has really stuck out to me over the last couple of games with Hughley is for the entire season, it's been okay, throw John out there with 4 minutes and 45 seconds left in the first half, or 8 minutes and 45 seconds left in the half, where you're getting that extra 45 seconds right into the media timeout, and you can get a couple extra breaths for Freemantle or whoever it is he's checking in for. But now you'll see John come out of the timeout still on the court, whereas before it was you get him that extra little rest and John's
Get him
going
out of
back to
there.
the bench.
Yeah.
He'll stay out there for that extra segment.
I'd be very curious to know where the coaching staff is at on John Hughley now, like where they feel like he's at in his development. Obviously, they're happy with the production he's added recently for this year's team. He's helping make a difference late in the season here, and that's great. But in terms of like you're heading into the offseason, you've got to make tough decisions in the transfer portal. It would seem that he's proven he can be a backup big man for you potentially. But I also would say, I don't think I would be comfortable going into next year with just Lassina Traore and John Hughley as your two big men coming back next year. That just doesn't, there's too many question marks once again. You already went through that this year. And okay, yeah, you're playing better at the end of the year, but Lassina Traore is now going to be a complete question mark coming off that injury. You already don't know exactly what it was going to look like with him this year. And then, yes, John Hughley's played better, but can he continue this and can he step up and give you even more next year if you need to call on him for more? It would be nice to have a bit more of a scoring presence in that post, I think. So I don't know. It's going to be a really interesting conversation that they're probably having daily right now inside the fourth floor of the Cintas Center. And I'd love to know where they come out on it here in another week or two.
Yeah, I think you see a lot of messages right now, whether it's on the message board or texts or whatever, tweets, doesn't matter, of, Xavier needs another scoring big man. Well, yeah, but so did 363 other teams in the country.
Right.
I mean, that is the most coveted position in the transfer portal, is somebody that can play around the rim and that can score and it can shoot. Jack Nungy is the most valuable player in the transfer portal in 2026 and beyond, right? That's just kind of the way that this game has evolved, which is wild to think about given where basketball is and how guard oriented the sport is in general. But you think back to the two national champions last year. I know they weren't the most talented scorers from, outside of a 2-foot range, but what did they both have? Purdue and UConn, they both had two monsters on the inside.
Yeah, and you talk to a lot of basketball people, and they'll tell you the difference makers are 6'7" and above. Everyone has guys that can play that are short. Under that 6'5", 6'6" range. There's a bunch of dudes who can play at all levels, even down to Division II and JUCO. We're seeing guys come up and make huge impact at the high major level out of nowhere now, and that's because there are so many guys at that size who can play. The unicorns, the ones that are hard to find, are the tall guys that can really play basketball too. And so, yeah, I mean, your point's well taken, Paul. It's a lot easier to just sit here and say you got to find better big men than what you've got. It's much more difficult to do that and also fit it into your budget now with NIL and everything that's going to go into that this offseason.
Rick, I want to go back to something you said a minute ago that Thad Matta said after the game last night. He said, Xavier's playing as well as anyone I've seen in the country right now. And to back that point up, I went to Bart Torvik on Thursday morning and I sorted it from February 10th on, which was the day after the Villanova loss that Monday. And since then, they're playing as the 10th best team in the country. Since February 16th, they're playing as the 7th best team in the country. All of that is to say that Xavier is playing at an elite level right now. And I think Thad Matta, who had a very interesting demeanor in the post-game press conference last night. I don't know if that was aired or if there was any video clips of that, but just
it was on YouTube.
Yeah, just the body language of him sitting there at the table. It was just very interesting to kind of observe him in the post-game press conference last night.
Do you think it's possible he's another veteran coach who has decided, first of all, this isn't going very well, and second of all, maybe this just isn't for me. It's not what I got into it for. It's not the way I want to do it, and I don't know that I want to see this through.
I mean, I don't have any inside information here. I'll preface this with that, but I would not be shocked if in 3 weeks Butler was looking for a new coach. And not to say that they're getting rid of him. I just think from Dad's just overall how the season has gone, he just it just looks like it's worn on him.
It could be interesting. I mean, I don't think that's a crazy thought to have, and
Yeah.
definitely he seemed. I mean, dejected. Obviously, when you lose on senior night, isn't surprising, but it almost felt a little more than that. A little not checked out, but I don't know. Yeah, I get what you mean. He had a weird demeanor there at the table in
Yeah.
the press conference.
But anyway, back to his point about Xavier being one of the best teams in the country right now. That's where I would say that at this point for Xavier, it's a just get in the tournament, right? Win this game on Saturday against Providence, win on Thursday against Marquette, assuming UConn beats Seton Hall this weekend. Xavier will play Marquette at 2:30 on Thursday afternoon next week. If this team right now gets into the NCAA tournament, whether it goes to Dayton, whether it becomes a last four buys and they, play a 6 seed straight up, I don't see this team playing their way into a 10 seed unless they win the Big East tournament. This team is a very dangerous team as they are playing right now. And if I was a 6 seed looking on the other side at an 11 seed Xavier team that had just won 7 of their last 8 games or 8 of their last 9 or 9 of their last 10 or whatever it is by that point, I would not be happy if I was that opposing coach trying to do that scout.
I think everybody is probably under that same impression right now that's watched Xavier play at all. Anybody that's had to scout them recently. I mean, we just talked about it with what Greg McDermott said. They're one of the more difficult teams to scout for. And I'm sure you wouldn't have heard that back in December or January, but it's a much different team right now with the way they're playing. And, one of the things that I think maybe gets taken for granted sometimes because he is so consistent is Zach Freemantle's play. I thought against Butler, he was as dominant and as locked in, dialed in with that hook shot. I think Thad's comment after the game was Zach's post game starts at 12 feet, and that's
Yeah.
really difficult to guard. And it's a good point. It's like he doesn't have to seal you deep on that block, which is good because he's not the biggest, most physical guy, but he catches it anywhere around the vicinity of the lane. He can just flip up that baby hook shot from anywhere, and he has such incredible touch with it. He was as good as I've ever seen against Butler.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. Just the entire Zach Freemantle experience last night. The media seating at Hinkle Fieldhouse is right behind the Xavier bench or the
Yeah.
visiting bench. So last night it was the Xavier bench, and so we were sitting right behind the families, and the Conwells had a million people there, obviously being Indianapolis natives, and there were all of the Xavier fans to our right, and then all the way back up into the 300s. It was like a wall of Xavier blue all the way back up. But down in front of us was the Xavier bench. And I mean, that picture that Isaac Feely got of Zach at the water cooler, looking back, kind of giving the little shrug, and then him talking back to the students, and then wearing the lei from Margaritaville in the post game handshake line, and everything about what Zach did last night, the laughs and the smiles coming off the court. It was a full on Zach Freemantle experience at Hinkle.
Yeah, it's good that we're getting this fun, loving, cocky version of Zach Freemantle here to end the year. Xavier's playing well. He's going out with a little bit of true Zach aura to him. It's not like a dejected, this thing didn't go as planned. Because when things don't go well for Zach, he has a bit of a different demeanor to him too. So it's fun getting to see this side of him to end his career here for sure.
Oh yeah, and Rick, I think back to that Monday or Tuesday or whatever it was in December where we're sitting there thinking that Zach's season is over.
Yeah.
Right? We had thought at that point that Xavier was just coming off a loss to the Crosstown Shootout, or in the Crosstown Shootout to Cincinnati, and Zach had potentially suffered a season-ending injury, and you're going, what is the direction of this season going to look like? Where is this team going to go? Then he only ends up missing three games. Thank goodness the winter break came when it did, that he didn't miss more games. But the 2 games that he missed were 2 of the most important games of the season. You have to hope that the selection committee factors that in, especially with how close those losses were. But all in all, for Zach and everything that he's gone through over his career with COVID and with, injuries and everything else, again, Xavier dug themselves in a hole in November and December that they're trying desperately to dig themselves out of right now. And at this point, just put them in, right? Just put them in, just get them in the tournament, and from there you'll just see what happens.
All right, so one final thought on Thad Matta's comments as we're
Yes.
going through, the coaches' comments here. I think we've touched on pretty much everything that was said, except for almost all of this has been focused on Xavier's offense for the most part. And I think perhaps the biggest part of this turnaround has been how much this team has improved defensively. And you were talking about our comments in the offseason and what we expected this team to be and how they've sort of morphed into that later in the year, but weren't there in the middle of the season. Well, the one thing I never expected was them to defend the way that they are defending right now. They're maybe not as good offensively. The upside never quite came to fruition, but they are better defensively. And I think that gives them kind of the same chance that I always thought they would have in terms of their talent level. And the comment was from Thad Matta was they really extended in the half court. They were literally fouling us when we went to screen. And both he and Greg McDermott had talked about Xavier's physicality and the way they're blowing up screens right now. And ball screens are so important in the game in general right now. Like everyone's running a bunch of zoom actions, a bunch of dribble handoffs, a bunch of ball screens, almost regardless of what system they're running. And to be able to defend well, you have to be able to defend ball screens well. And I think there was a point in the season where Xavier maybe wasn't doing that. And somehow through, I think, switching a lot more and being a lot more physical and aggressive on the ball, they have really rectified that problem. And in some cases, against some matchups, they've turned it into a strength. Like if they have enough athleticism to hang with the quickness of the opposing team's ball handlers, they can really pressure them pretty well. And with Dalen Swain's instincts out there and his length, he'll end up getting you a few steals playing like that.
Yeah, for as well as the offense is playing in that month stretch that I was just talking about, Xavier's defense is playing twice as well. I mean, they're 13th nationally over the last month defensively. They're 27th offensively. So the defense is right there with the offense, and it's complementary, and that's why they've put it all together.
Yeah, Paul, the metrics boost for Xavier, it's the narrative early in the non-conference season when they weren't winning those bye games by as much as they should have was they ruined their metrics. Well, late here, and especially the last two games, they've really done a nice job of boosting those metrics, maybe a little bit unexpectedly. They jumped up 13 spots in KenPom after the Butler win. Well, after the combination of the Creighton win and the Butler win, and 12 spots in Bart Torvik, I believe, after those two wins. How much do you think that actually helps them right now when we're talking about all this stuff in terms of an at-large bid? I mean, it's not a quad one win, which is what you'd really like to have, but how much does fixing the metrics a little bit late here give them an extra boost?
I think it's huge, and I would really caution people to not get too lost in the net because it's probably fourth on the priority list of what the committee looks at. It's something that they look at a lot because it's what they created to replace the RPI. So they do care about it. I'm not saying to totally write it off, but when you look at wins above the bubble, when you look at the strength of record, and when you look at the KPI, those resume metrics, those are the three that you're talking about when you hear the term resume metrics. That's the most important thing that the committee's looking at. And what's dragging Xavier down right now, to get into the weeds of it just for a second, is the KPI. And if you were on Twitter all day on Thursday, you've seen that metric getting dragged through the mud because it is such an outlier as compared to the strength of record and compared to the wins above the bubble for Xavier. And it was kind of interesting because Retire 52 tweeted at David Warlock, who's one of the media directors for the NCAA, and he basically just asked David, like I said, media coordinator for the NCAA, and said, how are outliers handled by the committee, right? If Xavier's KPI is 13 or 14 spots worse than every other metric that they have, and it's dragging Xavier down. And David responded and said, it's evaluated, as per outliers. They're pointed out during the selection committee, and they're in their meetings, and they're discussed. They know about it. They talk about it. And so if you're Xavier right now, yes, you don't have 5 quad one wins. Maybe UConn sneaks up into the back door of it, maybe. But even the quadrant wins are not all created equal. And what I mean by that is the committee understands that, yeah, it might not look like you have a 2-9 quad one record as opposed to 1-10 or whatever Xavier's might end up being. But at the same time, with UConn right on the fringe and with Creighton right on the fringe, beating tournament teams, beating teams in the field, that matters too. They don't look at conference record. They don't, a lot of people are criticizing Oklahoma or some of these SEC teams for,
Right.
A bad visual of their conference record. They look at the metrics, they look at the data, and then also the predictive metrics of Ken Pom and these other ones that you're talking about. It's all been boosted here in this last month. They're beating their predicted spreads on by the metrics by a lot, and because of that, they're moving up, and their net's not where they want it to be, and their KPI's not where they want it to be. But outside of that, their other metrics show that they are a tournament team, and it's going to be up to championship week next week to see how many bid thieves there are, how many teams go out and win their conference tournament that are going to steal a bid from teams that are already in the field, like a one bid league. Is VCU going to lose in the A10? Is UC San Diego going to lose in the Big West? Are we going to have an NC State from last year? Some of those teams.
Paul, let me get your thoughts on two things before we wrap this up.
Sure.
Give me an update on what you think XU's chances are if they beat Providence, meaning they completed what we talked about, winning out the regular season, and that's it. That's the end of it for them. They ended it with that 7-game winning streak. They ended it with 21-10 record. Where does that put them in your opinion? Do you think that's enough, or is it just we're going to have to see?
So they would lose on Thursday to Marquette?
Yes. Or whoever.
Yeah, or UConn, I guess at that point. It could be either one of them. I would like to think that Xavier would have done enough by that point. I think at 21 wins, at 13-7 in the Big East, with the resume that they have, and the fact that the committee has shown year after year that conference tournament week is not as evaluated and as highly thought of from a resume standpoint as we all think about it.
Yeah.
You do your work before you get to conference tournament week. You do your work in the regular season. I would like to think that 21 wins, you might be the last team in the field. You might be the last team to hear your name called. But I would like to think that that gets them in. I'm not as sure about that as I was, a month ago when I thought if Xavier finished 7-0, that they would be for sure a lock, and the 21 win stat that I'd rattled off before. I mean, I think there is a lot that's going to be decided if you have 5 bid stealers like you did last year. That's where the bubble becomes stronger. We keep hearing the bubble's weak, the bubble's weak. Well, it becomes stronger when other teams start to steal bids. If there aren't any bid thieves next week, which has happened, it has certainly happened that bid thieves, don't happen in a season. But if they don't, then I would like to think, Rick, that 21 wins is good enough for this team.
Yeah, part of what the people saying the bubble's weak this year, I think, have started to realize is the bubble looks weak based on previous standards we had for teams before we've realigned to these super conferences. And now the SEC and the Big Ten are going to be viewed differently. Teams with really bad records are going to be viewed differently than they've been viewed in previous years because of their opportunity for quad one wins and wins above bubble and all those types of things. So I think people are starting to adjust to what those metrics and standards and resumes look like now later in the season with the new conferences and the way they've realigned. And that's part of why the bubble has all of a sudden, quote unquote, strengthened here. But part of it too is I think we thought a lot of these teams would lose more games, and a lot of the teams that are sitting there right on the bubble have continued winning along with Xavier. And so there haven't been as many teams that have played their way out of this as we thought there might have been.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the teams that have continued to win have been SEC teams that have beaten up on each other. I mean, if you look outside of the SEC, some of these teams have lost some games. San Diego State lost the other night. Indiana lost the other night to Oregon. Nebraska was playing Ohio State, but still a bubble loss there. But if you just look at the SEC and these teams like Texas beating Missouri the other night, or Oklahoma, Texas winning their game against Mississippi State the other night. I could go down the list. These SEC teams are feeding off of each other. And it's going to come down to it on Selection Sunday. we're going to learn a lot this year from the selection committee, especially when they're considering wins above bubble for the first time, and Xavier's wins above bubble, especially if they beat Providence and then would win next week on Thursday. It would be a good enough metric for them to be in the tournament. We're going to learn a lot from this particular year's selection committee about how they value things. And I think this year will tell a lot of people, and scheduling, it's going to bear itself out in a big way what we learned from selection Sunday this year, because and not just on teams that get in versus don't get in, seeding too, because there are a lot of teams like Gonzaga is a perfect example. They're a metrics darling, but their resume kind of stinks. And so because of that, where do you put them, right? And I think even beyond the bubble, just everything we're going to learn from how the committee puts this particular bracket together is going to shape the next couple of years of the committee. And Rick, one last thing here. I keep coming back to in the last couple of weeks. I don't know when you said this, but you said it a while ago. I think you said this. It was somebody on the board. I wouldn't put it past the committee, because every year we talk about maybe a new metric gets added, or maybe a there's some fluidity to what they say that they value, and it's so hard for bracketologists to pin it, to figure it out, that maybe they like it that way. Maybe they like the unpredictability. Maybe they like the fact that you can't figure out what they're thinking, and that year over year there are differences and there are nuances to it. The committee does turn over just by nature of the people that are on it and what they in particular might value. But I don't think they mind that this is not a stone cold fact every year.
Well, look, the sports evolved too, right? Like we used to use the RPI as our main metric. And now we started being like, well, that's not really the best way to do it. Look at Vegas. It's way more accurate. And they're using advanced metrics like KenPom, predictive things, models to come up to their conclusions. So why don't we pay more attention to metrics like that? And so as those things evolve, you naturally change what you're prioritizing as a committee. And I think that's sort of naturally changed over time. But I do think there also might be a little bit of you're always trying to catch us, so to speak, by the committee going on as well.
Yep.
All right. The other thing I wanted to ask you about, Paul, we can talk all we want about an at-large resume, but I mean, are we getting to the point where maybe Xavier just has a chance to win the whole thing at Madison Square Garden? Maybe that's actually the path Xavier fans should be looking more at. I mean, what do you think their chances are to go to Madison Square Garden and come home with a championship now?
If they play Marquette on Thursday afternoon, which it's obviously trending to look that way, Marquette would be what, 1-5 against the top 3 of the Big East this year coming down the stretch, and they're not playing well right now. Then on Friday night, you have to assume that it would be St. John's. It'd be a road game for St. John's, playing for a chance to play on Saturday night in the Big East title game. But Xavier was up 16 on them at Madison Square Garden in front of a road game, road atmosphere a month and a half ago.
You'd rather have UConn, right? What? Well, I guess no, because that'd be first round. So
No.
you'd
You
rather
wouldn't play.
Marquette
You
than
wouldn't
UConn.
play UConn until Saturday night. They're
Yeah.
going to be on the other side of the bracket.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was mixing that up. You would rather have Marquette in the first round because otherwise UConn would be a first round
because then
game.
you're going to play 2 road games in a row.
Yeah.
One, I think Xavier matches up with Marquette better than UConn, especially right now. Terrace Reed looks incredible.
Yes,
Liam
I agree with
McNeely's
that.
back. Yeah.
I was
But
thinking St. John's, but that wouldn't even be the same round. That would be the semifinals versus the quarters.
yeah, so you go Marquette, St. John's, and then whoever comes out of the other side of the bracket, assuming St. John's takes care of either Providence or Butler. But Rick, who's to say? Who's to say this Xavier team couldn't do this right now?
Paul, Providence played St. John's within 2 both times.
And they took a buzzer beater at the AMP.
And I mean, Butler lost by 8 and 6. I don't see Butler being able to beat St. John's at Madison Square Garden in this situation, but like Providence, maybe you get a gift. You never know. If you get Providence in that second round waiting for you, look out. Then you've got a real shot to win this thing.
Yeah. And so that's where because Xavier has beaten everybody else in the league. The only team Xavier hasn't beaten this year is St. John's. And
it is a bad matchup. I mean, they had them down by 16, but that to me felt a little fluky, but I also think Xavier's gotten better since then. So
yeah.
Who knows? I mean, with the way they're playing right now.
Rick, Why not?
I don't think it's crazy, Paul.
I don't think I'm to the point now with this team, assuming they beat Providence on Saturday afternoon, which they is obviously a huge one. You can't drop that senior night, which starts a half hour before the game. They don't do it after the game. Some teams do it after the game. Senior night is before the game on Saturday afternoon. That'll start at 3:30. Assuming you beat Providence, I don't have any reason to believe why this Xavier team couldn't win the big. They are playing the best by the data. This is not just me saying this. By the data, they are playing 18 spots better than the next best Big East team over the last month, and that's St. John's. But they're playing, 19 spots better than the next best team in the Big East over the last month.
I mean, that kind of says it
go
right
win
there.
It, Rick. Go win it, Rick.
Kind of says it right there, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Have you seen tournament odds for the Big East? I just looked at FanDuel; they didn't have any up. What are Xavier's chances to
I
win
have
the Big East
not.
tournament? Do we know?
I have not. You mean to win the Big East tournament? Or?
Yeah, to win the Big East tournament, they've got to be like plus 600 or longer, right?
Yeah, I haven't seen. Let's see if I can find it here real quick. This is great podcasting. I have not seen any odds. No, I don't see. The odds are not up yet.
Okay, that's okay. We'll. I saw them for pretty much every conference except for the Big East, but we'll talk about that on the message board or something. Paul, any content that people need to be aware of other than Rebound Rundown that's coming out daily during every weekday?
Yep. Next week, the 8th episode of the All In docuseries will come out on Tuesday night. This one is exceptionally cool. It's one of my favorites that we've done this year, if not my favorite. Josh is still finishing it up, but it'll have everything to wrap up the regular season. I think he's going to be able to squeeze the Providence game and senior night in there as well. Just turnaround time on that, we'll see. But Tuesday night, next Tuesday night, 11:30 on Fox 19. If you're local, it'll be the next day on YouTube. And so be on the lookout for that. It'll be a great one.
All right. So the next All In documentary next Tuesday. Also, the Rebound Rundown every weekday morning. Check that out. It's been great so far. You've had a lot of good guest interviews, a lot of good audio on there, recapping the action each night. And right now in local basketball, there's been a lot of good stuff to talk about with some of the teams playing
good
well.
Luck to the Norse tonight.
Yeah, big game.
Good luck to the Norse tonight. Come on, Rick.
Big game here in Cleveland. Hopefully we come back victorious. But we will talk all about the Musketeers and more on the message board. Thanks, Paul.